Before you watch this powerful story about privilege, compassion, and standing up for what's right, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss these incredible moments when justice and kindness triumph. This story will absolutely inspire you. Don't miss it. The airport terminal was crowded and chaotic that morning. It was a busy travel day during the holiday season. Families were heading to destinations. Business travelers were rushing to catch flights. The departure lounge was packed with people sitting, standing, and waiting for their flights to be called. In the middle of all this chaos, a pregnant woman named Rachel Mitchell, 32 years old and 8 months pregnant, was struggling to find a place to sit. She'd been standing for over 20 minutes, and her back was aching terribly. Her feet were swollen. Her legs were exhausted. She was experiencing the physical strain that comes with carrying a nearly full-term baby. Rachel spotted 4 empty seats in a row. They appeared to be available. She was exhausted and desperate to sit down. But as she approached the seats, she noticed that 4 wealthy-looking travelers, probably in their 50s and 60s, had placed their expensive designer bags on the seats to claim them. The bags were more valuable than the seats themselves. Rachel approached politely. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Would you mind moving your bags? I'm pregnant and really need to sit down." The oldest woman, wearing a designer outfit and expensive jewelry, looked Rachel up and down dismissively. "These seats are taken," the woman said coldly, not moving her bag an inch. "I understand," Rachel said, trying to be respectful. "But I'm 8 months pregnant and having difficulty standing. Would you be willing to move your bags just for a few minutes?" A second woman, dressed equally expensively, let out an exasperated sigh. "There are other seats," she said sharply. "Stop making this our problem." Rachel felt her eyes welling with tears. She was humiliated. She was exhausted. She was struggling with the physical demands of pregnancy, and these women were refusing to show even basic human compassion. She turned away, defeated. But what happened in the next few minutes would teach these women a lesson they would never forget. A moment of cruelty would trigger a series of events that would expose them publicly and force them to face real consequences. To understand why this moment was so significant, you need to know the real story behind Rachel and what her life was actually like. Rachel Mitchell was 32 years old and a middle school teacher. She'd been married to her husband James for 5 years. They'd been trying to have a baby for 3 years. Rachel had experienced 2 miscarriages before finally becoming pregnant with the baby she was now carrying. This pregnancy was everything to Rachel. It was the culmination of years of hoping, praying, and heartbreak. She was fiercely protective of her pregnancy. She took every precaution. She attended every doctor's appointment. She read every book about prenatal care. But she was also terrified. At 32, she was considered advanced maternal age for a first-time pregnancy. She'd been warned about increased risks. Every day was a mix of excitement and anxiety. The flight she was trying to catch was to visit her parents in Florida. Her mother, who had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer, wanted to see her daughter before the baby was born. This was an important trip, possibly the last time her mother would see her before becoming a grandmother. Rachel had been working until the day before. She'd prepared her classroom for a substitute teacher. She was exhausted from work, from pregnancy, and from the emotional weight of her mother's health crisis. She simply wanted to sit down for a moment and breathe. The women were a group of retired wealthy women who traveled together regularly. They called themselves the Travel Club. They had money, lots of it. They stayed in 5-star hotels. They flew first class when they could. They had jewelry, designer clothes, and expensive handbags. These women had spent their entire lives getting whatever they wanted whenever they wanted it. They had raised children who were also accustomed to privilege. They had created an entire worldview in which their comfort and convenience were paramount, and everyone else's needs were secondary. They'd never been told no. They'd never faced real consequences. They'd never been held accountable for their behavior. One of the women, Margaret, we'll call her, had raised children who were entitled and selfish. Those children had raised their own children the same way. The entire family was focused on wealth, status, and getting what they wanted. But Margaret's grandchild, her daughter's 17-year-old son, was different. He'd started questioning the family values. He'd started wondering if there was more to life than accumulating wealth and status. The setting asterisk an airport departure lounge. Morning of a busy travel day. Packed with travelers. Rachel looking for a seat. 4 wealthy women claiming seats with their expensive bags. The conflict asterisk a fundamental clash between privilege and compassion, between entitlement and empathy, between a woman desperately needing help and people too selfish to provide it. The stakes asterisk not just a seat on a plane, but Rachel's dignity, her physical health, the message about what kind of society we are when we treat pregnant women with such cruelty. Rachel had walked away from the women, defeated and humiliated. She was standing near a window, hand on her back, trying to support the weight of her pregnant belly. That's when she heard someone behind her. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Rachel turned to see a young man, probably in his late teens or early 20s. He was dressed in casual clothes and had the kind of genuine concern in his eyes that immediately made Rachel trust him. "I'm just tired," Rachel said. "I'm pregnant and having trouble finding a seat." The young man's expression immediately changed from concern to anger. He'd obviously overheard the interaction with the wealthy women. He'd been sitting nearby watching the entire exchange. "That's not right," he said firmly. "Come with me." He walked Rachel over to a row of seats, and he personally moved his own bag to clear a seat for her. Then he sat down next to her. "I'm Tyler," he said. "I'm sorry you were treated that way." Rachel sat down with profound relief. Just sitting felt miraculous after standing for so long. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Rachel." They started talking. Tyler explained that he was heading home to visit his family. Rachel explained that she was flying to visit her mother, who was ill. And then Rachel asked the question that would change everything. "Those women over there," Rachel said, pointing to the group. "Do you know them?" Tyler's face went pale. That's my grandmother," he said quietly. "And her friends." Rachel immediately felt uncomfortable. She didn't want to cause trouble between Tyler and his family. "It's okay," Rachel said quickly. "Don't worry about it." But Tyler was clearly bothered. He was upset. He was seeing his family through new eyes, not as the people he'd been taught to respect and emulate, but as people who were cruel and selfish. "It's not okay," Tyler said firmly. "And I'm going to make sure they understand that." He stood up and walked over to the group of women. Rachel watched as he confronted them. Even from a distance, Rachel could see his grandmother's face go red with embarrassment and anger. She could see the other women looking uncomfortable. She could see Tyler speaking passionately, clearly telling them about their behavior. A few moments later, the women started looking around the departure lounge. Their eyes landed on Rachel. Margaret, Tyler's grandmother, stood up and walked over to Rachel. "I apologize," Margaret said stiffly. "My grandson has informed me that I behaved inappropriately." Rachel was stunned. She hadn't expected an apology. "It's okay," Rachel said, trying to be gracious. But Margaret wasn't done. She was clearly embarrassed and angry. But instead of directing that anger at herself, she was directing it at Rachel. "Though I think your grandson is overreacting," Margaret said coldly. "We simply wanted to keep our seats. We didn't know you needed to sit that desperately." "She's pregnant," Tyler said, clearly furious. "Extremely pregnant. And she was clearly struggling." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "There are plenty of seats available elsewhere," Margaret said. She could have looked harder. That's when something incredible happened. A flight attendant who had been observing the entire situation stepped in. Her name was Patricia, and she'd been a flight attendant for 28 years. She'd seen every kind of behavior imaginable. She was tired of wealthy people treating other passengers disrespectfully. "I need to speak to you all," Patricia said, her voice calm but firm, addressing the group of wealthy women. She gestured for them to follow her to a quieter area of the terminal. Rachel and Tyler watched as Patricia spoke to them. Even from a distance, Rachel could see the women getting increasingly uncomfortable. Patricia was clearly telling them something they didn't want to hear. After about 5 minutes, Patricia returned to Rachel. "I've informed those passengers that their behavior was unacceptable," Patricia said. "I've also informed them that if they display similar behavior on the aircraft, they will be removed and banned from flying with our airline." Patricia paused, then added, "And I want you to know that when we board, I'm going to ensure you get a comfortable seat. You should not be standing on this flight." Rachel felt tears of gratitude filling her eyes. A few minutes later, the flight was called for boarding. As the wealthy women got in line to board, Tyler approached them one more time. "I'm ashamed of you," he said to his grandmother. His voice was quiet, but devastating in its sincerity. "I'm ashamed that I've been raised to be like you. I'm going to be different. I'm going to be better." Margaret's face went completely white. The rejection from her own grandson, the realization that her behavior had caused her grandson to feel ashamed of her. That was more painful than anything else that had happened that day. Within hours, the story had spread. Tyler had posted about the incident on social media. He described how his grandmother and her friends had refused to let a pregnant woman sit down. He described their dismissive and cruel behavior. He described how a flight attendant had stepped in and held them accountable. The post went viral. By the time Rachel landed in Florida, the video had millions of views. News outlets were picking up the story. Social media was filled with comments criticizing the women and praising Tyler and Patricia for doing the right thing. The women's names were identified. Their social media accounts were flooded with comments about their behavior. People were angry. People were disgusted. But more importantly, investigative journalists started looking into who these women were. They discovered that Margaret and her friends were members of an exclusive country club. They discovered that they were major donors to certain charities. They discovered their financial information was public in certain contexts. One journalist discovered something particularly damaging. Margaret had been a volunteer for a women's health organization for years. She'd been praised as a champion of women's rights. She'd spoken publicly about the importance of supporting vulnerable women. The hypocrisy was glaring. The woman who claimed to care about vulnerable women had just refused to show basic compassion to a pregnant woman. The Women's Health Organization immediately distanced themselves from Margaret. They released a statement saying that her behavior was inconsistent with their values, and they were severing their relationship with her. Margaret's Country Club received thousands of calls and emails demanding that they address Margaret's behavior. The club leadership was horrified. They saw their reputation being damaged by association. The country club voted unanimously to suspend Margaret's membership, pending an investigation into her conduct. But the most significant impact came on Tyler's family. Tyler's mother, Margaret's daughter, was horrified by her mother's behavior. She called Tyler and apologized profusely. She told him that his response had been appropriate and necessary. She told him that she was going to have a serious conversation with her mother about her values and her behavior. Tyler's father told him he was proud of him for standing up against injustice, even when it involved his own family. The conversation between Margaret and her family was devastating. Margaret had spent her entire life assuming that her wealth and status gave her the right to treat people poorly. Now, she was facing the reality that her own family was ashamed of her. She had a choice: double down on her entitlement or actually change. Margaret chose to change. She publicly apologized to Rachel. She posted on social media acknowledging her behavior as unacceptable. She explained that she'd been raised to believe that wealth made her superior, and she was working to change that deeply ingrained belief system. She reached out to the Women's Health Organization and asked how she could actually contribute meaningfully to supporting vulnerable women. They suggested she volunteer at a shelter for pregnant women experiencing homelessness. Margaret started volunteering. She attended training about privilege, entitlement, and compassion. She learned about the real struggles that pregnant women face. Not just wealthy women like herself, but women in poverty, women without support systems, women experiencing health crises. Her entire worldview began to shift. She reached out to Rachel and apologized in person. Rachel, who was now back home pregnant and dealing with her mother's illness, initially didn't want to meet with Margaret. But Rachel's mother encouraged her. "Sometimes people need an opportunity to make amends," Rachel's mother said. "Sometimes giving that opportunity is an act of grace." Rachel agreed to meet with Margaret. When they met, Margaret was genuinely remorseful. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't minimizing what she'd done. She was truly understanding how her behavior had affected Rachel. "I treated you like you didn't matter," Margaret said. "And that was inexcusable. I treated you poorly when you were vulnerable and needed help. And I want you to know that I'm working to be a better person." Rachel saw genuine change in Margaret. She saw someone who was actually confronting her privilege and her entitlement. "Thank you for apologizing," Rachel said. "That means something." And then Rachel did something generous. She invited Margaret to her baby shower. It was an unusual gesture, inviting the woman who'd humiliated you to your most important celebration. But Rachel understood something about forgiveness and redemption. She understood that giving Margaret the opportunity to be part of something positive could reinforce her transformation. Margaret attended the baby shower. She brought thoughtful gifts. She engaged warmly with Rachel's family and friends. She was a different person than the woman at the airport. When Rachel gave birth to a healthy baby girl a few weeks later, Margaret was there to meet her. Not as the entitled, dismissive woman from the airport, but as someone genuinely invested in Rachel's well-being. 2 years after the airport incident, Rachel had returned to teaching. Her daughter, Emma, was a healthy and happy 2-year-old. Rachel's mother had completed her cancer treatment and was in remission. Rachel stayed in touch with Margaret. They'd become unlikely friends. Margaret had become a mentor figure in Rachel's life. She'd also become Aunt Margaret to Emma. But more significantly, Margaret had transformed her life. She'd stepped down from various positions that required her to maintain an image of superiority. She'd spent significant time volunteering with pregnant women experiencing homelessness. She'd used her wealth and connections to advocate for better resources for vulnerable pregnant women. She'd also had crucial conversations with her daughter and other family members about privilege, entitlement, and responsibility. Tyler, the grandson who'd stood up to her, had studied social work in college. He was now working with an organization helping low-income families. He remained close to his grandmother, but also held her accountable. He was the bridge between Margaret's old life of entitlement and her new life of compassion. Patricia, the flight attendant, had been recognized by the airline for her actions. She was promoted to a training position where she taught other flight attendants how to recognize and address discriminatory behavior. The story had become a teaching moment in airlines across the country. Flight attendants were trained about how to support pregnant women, how to address passenger misconduct, and how to stand up for vulnerable people. Most importantly, Rachel received messages from hundreds of women who'd been inspired by her story and Tyler's courage to do the right thing. One woman wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself when I was being treated poorly. I realized I didn't have to accept disrespect. Thank you for showing me that." Another woman wrote, "I was like those women, privileged and entitled and cruel. Your story made me examine my own behavior. I'm working to be kinder. Thank you for that wake-up call." A pregnant woman wrote, "I was treated similarly by privileged people who didn't believe I deserved basic respect. Your story validated my experience and helped me understand that their cruelty said nothing about my worth." Letters and messages came in regularly. People sharing how the story had impacted them. People thanking Rachel and Tyler for standing up. People grateful that Margaret had chosen to change. The real moral asterisk. This story teaches us something profound about privilege, empathy, and the power of standing up for what's right. Those wealthy women at the airport had spent their entire lives assuming that their money and status gave them the right to treat other people poorly. They'd assumed they could claim seats with bags while a pregnant woman stood struggling. They'd assumed that the pregnant woman was being unreasonable for asking them to move. But their privilege had blinded them to a fundamental truth. Every person deserves basic human dignity and respect, regardless of their economic status. What changed Margaret was not shame, though she certainly felt that. What changed Margaret was actually being confronted by her own grandson. It was seeing through his eyes that her behavior was cruel and unacceptable. It was having her family distance themselves from her until she chose to change. But also, what changed Margaret was the opportunity to do better. Rachel could have refused to meet with Margaret. Rachel could have held on to anger and resentment. Instead, Rachel gave Margaret an opportunity to apologize and to change. And Margaret took that opportunity. She did the work. She examined her beliefs. She volunteered. She learned. She grew. The universal truth asterisk. We live in a world where privilege is often invisible to those who have it. Wealthy people often don't realize how their entitlement and dismissal affects others. They often don't see how their casual cruelty can humiliate someone who's already struggling. But when someone stands up and says, "That's not okay," when someone, especially someone in the privileged person's own family, says, "I'm ashamed of you," that can be a wake-up call. Tyler could have stayed silent. He could have let his grandmother's behavior slide. He could have rationalized it or defended her. Many people would have. Many people do when it's family involved. But Tyler chose to stand up. He chose to say that her behavior was wrong. He chose to let her know that her cruelty made him ashamed to be part of her family. And that, more than anything else, drove change. Rachel could have responded with anger and bitterness when Margaret approached her. But she chose grace. She chose to believe that people could change. She chose to give Margaret an opportunity to make amends. And that grace created the conditions for genuine transformation. For everyone watching this story asterisk, ask yourself, where am I using privilege to dismiss or disrespect others? Where am I taking seats, literally or metaphorically, that should be available to people who need them more than I do? Where am I being cruel to people who are struggling? Because all of us have some form of privilege. Maybe it's economic privilege. Maybe it's health privilege. Maybe it's educational privilege. Maybe it's simply the privilege of not having to struggle the way someone else is struggling. The question is, what will we do with that privilege? Will we use it to elevate ourselves above others? Or will we use it to help lift others up? Will we, like Margaret, have to be publicly humiliated and shamed into compassion? Or will we, like Tyler, have the wisdom to speak up when we see cruelty, even in our own families? Will we, like Rachel, have the grace to believe in people's capacity to change? Or will we hold on to anger and resentment? This story shows us that change is possible. That compassion can overcome entitlement. That grace can transform cruelty into kindness. But it requires people like Tyler to stand up, people like Rachel to offer grace, and people like Margaret to be willing to genuinely change. Did this story move you? Did it show you the transformative power of standing up for what's right and offering grace to those who are willing to change? Smash that like button right now and hit subscribe, because stories like this prove that speaking up against cruelty, even when it involves family, can change hearts and create real transformation. From a moment of dismissal at an airport to a woman's entire life changing. This is what happens when someone has the courage to confront entitlement. You absolutely don't want to miss the next story where compassion and justice create lasting change. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and let's keep celebrating the people who stand up for dignity and treat every person with respect. Flexed biceps red heart, sparkles asterisk asterisk.